Things you probably didn't know about royal birth rituals from the medieval era to today. Being a royal didn't make childbirth any easier. If anything, these rituals made it more challenging. From bed rest to lavish gifts, I will explore the myths and rituals tied to royal pregnancies. Queens of the past gave birth in front of many people. In the past, queens gave birth in front of numerous people, including royal officials and servants, to prevent any scandals. For example, in 1778, Marie Antoinette gave birth with up to 200 people watching. Her bed chambermaid recalled, "When the obstetrician announced the Queen is going to give birth, so many people rushed into the room that the Queen was nearly crushed." She added that 2 chimney sweeps even climbed on furniture for a better view. Royal mothers received birth trays, but not for the reasons you might think. In 14th century Italy, new mothers were often given elaborately decorated birth trays to celebrate a successful birth. These trays, adorned with religious, mythological, or literary themes, were presented to the exhausted mother, covered with a protective cloth and filled with nourishing food and sometimes small gifts. The trays, many of which were specially commissioned, could be hung up on the wall as cherished art pieces, celebrating a healthy birth. Florentine ruler Lorenzo de' Medici kept his tray, illustrated with the triumph of fame, in his private quarters until he died. Cravings were both a challenge and no problem. Expectant mothers often have unusual food cravings, and for a royal mum to be, getting these cravings satisfied was much easier. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, craved quail meat while pregnant with the future Edward VI. To keep her happy, a devoted Henry had the delicacy shipped from Calais. Before pregnancy tests, there was urine. Before accurate pregnancy tests existed, determining pregnancy was tricky. Some women didn't know they were expectant until they felt the baby move, known as quickening. In Tudor times, pale yellow to white urine with a cloudy surface was thought to indicate pregnancy. Other methods included leaving a needle in a woman's urine to see if it rusted, or mixing urine with wine to observe any changes. Push presents aren't just a new thing. Today's push presents, where dad gives gifts to mum after birth, aren't new. When Napoleon's wife Marie Louise had a son, he supposedly gave her a necklace with lots of diamonds. Edward IV was also happy when his first child, a girl, was born. He sent his wife Elizabeth Woodville a jewelled ornament. Only royals could get the special birth girdles. Giving birth was risky in medieval times. There were special girdles with charms and prayers to protect mothers and babies. Royals had access to the holiest ones, like the girdle of the Virgin at St. Peter's, Westminster. In 1242, Henry III's wife Eleanor of Provence got the Westminster girdle before having her daughter, Beatrice. It was supposed to ease pain and help with contractions. Lying in was a big deal. But it wasn't like today's lying in bed. Before giving birth, royal and noble women shut themselves away in a special room. They called it lying in. The birthing room was like a second womb, made to be calm for the baby. They lit fires, shut windows, and covered them with peaceful tapestries. No matter the weather, they scattered religious things around for comfort. The room was dim and quiet because bright light could hurt the moms-to-be's eyes. She stayed there until the baby was born. Many royal kids were actually born outside of marriage. Throughout history, kings have had kids who weren't born in wedlock. George III's 15 kids had 56 illegitimate children. But being illegitimate didn't always bring shame. Henry VIII really liked his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, born to his mistress, Bessie Blount, in 1519. He named him Henry Fitzroy and made him the Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Fitzroy was the only illegitimate kid that Henry formally recognised. It didn't matter if Fitzroy was legitimate, though, because he died at 17 years old. Picking names for royal babies was tricky. Choosing a name for a baby is hard, but for a royal baby it's even tougher. They often reuse names like Elizabeth, George or Henry, but some names are avoided because they're unlucky or remind people of bad things. Names like John because of bad King John, or Oliver because of Cromwell's rebellion in the 17th century. Only women were allowed in delivery rooms. For centuries, only women were allowed in the delivery room. Even in the 19th and early 20th century, it was rare for dads to be there. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, was an exception. He was there for some of their children's births, and Victoria said that he was a kind and wise nurse. Male midwives didn't show up until the 1700s. Before the 18th century, only women helped with childbirth, but in the 1700s, men started to become midwives, and men charged more, so having one meant that you were rich. Also, people thought medical stuff was a man's job, and by 1764, men were allowed in the royal birth chamber. William Hunter was Queen Charlotte's royal midwife. Royal mums usually didn't breastfeed. Instead, they hired someone called a wet nurse to feed their babies. Breastfeeding was seen as gross, but also as a way to not get pregnant again too soon. Queens needed to have more babies, so breastfeeding wasn't practical. People thought that if a queen had sex before stopping breastfeeding, her milk would go bad, and the first milk, colostrum, was thought to be bad for babies. Wet nurses often got close to the babies they fed. Back then, babies were breastfed for longer than they are now, and sometimes until they were 2 years old. Being a royal wet nurse could make a lot of money. Henry VIII's wet nurse got £10 a year, which could be more like £5,000 today. The Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun loved his wet nurse, so much that he built her a fancy tomb when she died. Royal parents didn't have to lose their sleep. It's no surprise that royal parents didn't have to wake up in the night for their children. They had servants to take care of them. Baby Henry VIII had 2 cradles. One was even covered in fancy cloth. 2 women were hired just to rock his cradle and help him sleep. Many royal children grew up in Eltham Palace. From the 14th to the 16th century, Eltham Palace in Kent was where royal children were raised. Edward III and Henry VIII spent a lot of their childhood there. It was a favourite royal home during that time, with Henry IV spending most of his Christmases there. In Britain, girls can be queens. For a long time, only men could be kings in England, but in 2013 they changed the rules. Now, if a girl is born first, she can be queen too, even if her brothers are alive. And if royal twins are born, the older one gets to be the king or queen, even if it's only by a few minutes. This hasn't happened in England yet, but it did in Scotland. James II of Scotland had a twin brother, Alexander, who died before he turned 1.